Historic buildings all have a different sense, don't they? But one of the beauties of this building is that it's so untouched and it's so pristine that you really can find yourself transported back. You can stand in a space and think that it really hasn't changed a huge amount since the mid-18th century. I like to look at buildings from an archaeological point of view, so I see the kitchen as a giant archaeological site, if you like. I'm very interested in the nuts and bolts of the building and the fact that it's a very rare survival of an 18th century kitchen. And none of us had any idea that it would be so well preserved. What a fantastic gem it was. We did a lot of investigation, and that was the main thing, was to learn as much as possible about the building. Some things survive, other things don't, but they leave a trace, if you like. So we get patterns on the walls, impressions in the plaster, the stone on the floor, even that can be read as a sort of archaeological site. And we were able to trace where items of furniture once stood, where there had been sinks, for example, all that kind of thing. All gone, but just a very faint pattern left in the stones. You get to a point where you think you know everything. You think you've done the building and you've learned everything there is to know about it, and then somebody comes in with a slightly different perspective and they blow that all away, and you realise that every time you come here, every time I come here, I learn something new. I see something new and I spot a new feature, if you like. The scullery is one of the preparation rooms, so quite important, and two things which survive in here which are of great importance are the dresser and the original grate. So a very small grate, but still has its early 18th century ironwork in it. It's an exceptionally rare survival. The bench, well, it's a preparation table essentially. You would stand along it and it has a shelf above it where you could store pots and pans. And again, it's the sort of thing that would in a well-used kitchen would just be replaced as soon as it wore out. But because Q was only used infrequently and then was abandoned, it survives, and it still has its original 18th century paint surfaces, so it's about as good as we'll ever find, I think. Well, when we first came to the kitchens, we had to decide what we were going to do with the building, and that could be anything from leave it exactly as we found it, or we could go to the opposite end of the spectrum and completely reconstruct it. And I think that we had to draw a balance somewhere between the two. We wanted to take away all the distracting things, but still let the building speak for itself. Paint is an extremely useful tool these days for looking at buildings. By picking apart the paint history, you can tell how that room has evolved, how it's been used, how it's been decorated, what it's looked like over the centuries. Some of the external paintwork, we found 27 layers of paint. The 18th century is an important time in the development of science and scientific principles. And I like the idea that you can see that not just with people doing experiments or discovering vaccinations and all the things that we know about, but also they apply their scientific reasoning right down the scale, even down to the level of a kitchen. Each of these rooms has its own specific purpose, which suggests that the building is carefully thought out to make the act of cooking as efficient as possible. And that's very much a reflection of the way people were thinking in the 18th century with scientific reasoning, with logic, that kind of thing.